Great, thank you. And I do want to acknowledge my co-authors in this paper, particularly Juan, who was an intern with our lab 2 summers ago and did most of the legwork on this actual project. So I was going to start out talking about how all of the sort of amazing promise of doing game streaming research, but then I find myself in the middle of a game streaming research session, and so I feel like I'm kind of preaching to the choir. There's a lot of really interesting stuff that can be gotten out of looking at behavior on platforms like Twitch, whether it's social things like the patronage study we just saw, or interesting interactions on how essentially every Twitch streamer is more or less think aloud playing a game all the time. And in our lab, we've been looking at a couple different things on Twitch and on game streaming, in particular things like audience participation games, looking at sort of the social roles of chatbots, and also looking at how we can augment the viewer experience with sort of game-aware metadata. And in the process of doing this, we're building a lot of systems, and we're creating a lot of things, and we sort of started to realize, is there like a higher umbrella under which all these things could potentially live and also potentially benefit the community more? And so this is where this notion of Toward a Twitch Toolkit came up. And so our motivation was essentially, what would be the needs of a sort of common community research toolkit for game streaming? And how have other researchers approached this space in the past? And so we did what academics do, and started doing a formal lit review of game streaming research, but with a particular interest in not necessarily what have we learned about game streaming, but how have we gone about learning it? And so that's kind of what this literature review is. And so just to do the basic metadata of the metadata, we looked at 11 different literature databases, sort of common things where any kind of computer science research would show up. We also directly searched the proceedings and archives of things that we just happen to know are commonly not archived. So by the way, if you're associated with any of those venues, try to get them archived. But Games Learning Society, Meaningful Play, and then GameStudies.org. And then our search terms were sort of basic notions of game streaming, Twitch, Twitch TV, Twitch streaming, YouTube Live. We tried throwing in a couple other names of less well-known streaming services, and it didn't really change the sample. So our inclusion criteria was something had to be a peer-reviewed conference or journal article published between 2011, which was the launch of Twitch, and then cutting off at the publication of the proceedings of CHI 2018. So there's actually like a whole year-ish of data missing from this, but this was when we were doing this work. It had to be written in English, and then importantly, it had to be a study of some aspect of behavior in, on, or of a game streaming service, and it had to be an empirical investigation in which some kind of data was collected, because our main thing here was thinking about what kinds of data collection support would need to be made, and so we were looking primarily at things where data was being collected. And then once we got all the papers, we did some coding. Our first dimension that we looked at was essentially what's the focus of this research? Is it primarily on the viewer experience, the streamer experience, both, or is it primarily associated with like the platform? And so that's like population level stuff, like how many people are using Twitch. There's also some interesting sort of engineering papers about bandwidth and stuff like that. And then our second major dimension was what was the primary research method being used here? And we didn't want to get all political in figuring out what is and isn't types of research, so we punted that notion to this book called Ways of Knowing in HCI. Highly recommend it to any of the PhD students in the audience. And essentially, the coding strategy here was which chapter in this book would describe the research in this paper. And then so the categories we have on the right, I'm not going to read through the whole list, are the ones that we ended up using. There are many other chapters, you will notice, that are not there, but they didn't end up really hitting in our coding scheme. And then the third thing that we coded on, which was a bit more of an open coding process, we went back and forth on this one a little bit, was what is the type of data being collected in this study? And this is also one where we allowed ourselves to code a particular study more than once for different dimensions of this code. And so So the first couple, so field notes, interviews, questionnaires are kind of your traditional kinds of research pieces. So field notes would be things like ethnographies, anything where a researcher is recording stuff without using sort of an auto recorder. Interviews is sort of traditional interviews. Questionnaires would also include surveys or sort of like validated instruments, anything where essentially you're filling out a form. And then I do want to get a little bit more into stream data, chat interaction, and platform. So stream data for us was essentially anything that is the video content of the stream. Often that's being coded somehow by some researchers. Chat data is all the content of the chat log, often being interacted with IRC. Interaction data is everything else on the page that is not the video or the chat, which sometimes means sort of novel overlay techniques. We also threw in eye tracking into interaction data, mainly because there was only one example and it had to go somewhere. But if you want, you could consider that one to be different. And then platform data is essentially stuff that's available at the platform level. So things like you can get out of public APIs or scraping a web page. And so the results. The initial search terms gave us 922 papers because the word Twitch shows up in medical literature a lot. And so Juan did the Herculean task of going through all of that and removing a lot of stuff based purely on title and venue mismatch to get down to 91. Then we reviewed those 91 abstracts to get down to 55, which we then had all the papers and had everybody read through. To check against our last sort of inclusion criteria, so some things weren't clearly empirical research, so we cut them out. And then also there were a couple of cases where we would get both like the late-breaking work version and the full version of a particular study, and we'd only look at one. And so to look at some of the trends over time, I kind of think about this as kind of having like 3 generations, more or less, of research. We were sort of like, what is Twitch? And that's largely platform data, looking at user counts and things like that. And then there's sort of why do people use Twitch, which we're still kind of in. And then there's like, well, what now can we do with Twitch? It's kind of what I've been seeing more recently with work. But essentially, we started out looking at the platform, with a couple one-offs here and there. And more recently, we were extremely interested in viewers. And I think that trend has continued from what I've sort of seen. Bear in mind that the 2018 stops at May. In terms of research method, the big takeaway here is essentially we've diversified a lot over time. We initially were doing a lot of log data stuff, so things scrapable from APIs, things that can be gotten from looking at the website. But more recently, we've been integrating a lot more interesting stuff, much more design-based research kinds of techniques, and also started to do some experiments, which are comparatively rare in the sample. And then in terms of data being collected, we started out largely looking at platform data, but have much more recently gotten really interested in chat. There's a lot of questionnaires and surveys that have been done more recently, so that's where that large jump in questionnaires comes from. And so after taking in all of this, and there's a little bit more sort of digestion in the paper, along with the actual whole corpus with all the codes, if you want to come fight me that I miscoded your paper, we came up with sort of 3 categories of research that we call technically agnostic, technically supported, and technically challenging. And so technically agnostic studies are essentially methods that have no inherent technical requirements. So this is largely your base of qualitative methods, things like ethnography, interviews, surveys, which really only require that you have some means of contacting your participant and dialoguing with them in some way. And so it doesn't really matter so much how Twitch is built or any game streaming service is built to impact these. Technically supported studies are things that use data provided by public APIs or existing tool chains. So things like querying Twitch as a RESTful API where you can get things like subscriber counts and stuff like that. Scraping the web page to find out what's popular right now or doing samples like that. Capturing things in chat with IRC. And while this has worked for a while, one of the challenges that it does kind of pose is you have the data that the platform lets you have. And so if you want to get around that, you might need something else. And so technically challenging studies are research is currently difficult to do with existing tools, and we largely read this by their lack of existence in the corpus. So things like conditional experiments with viewers, it's really hard to assign people to conditions and keep them in conditions when they can come and go whenever they want. User interactions beyond basic video and chat interactions are kind of hard to tell because you don't really have instrumentation into that. Cross-modality interactions between streamers and viewers. So for example, a viewer might chat something, the streamer might read it, say it out loud onto the audio, and that suddenly changes the chat. That's incredibly hard to get a sense of if you don't have sensors going on for all that stuff at once. So some of our future work will be reaching out to current Twitch researchers to better understand the logistical challenges they actually faced. So we sort of see a gap in the literature here, but we don't really know exactly why it's there. Some of you might have already responded to that survey. If you want to add more, please let me know. And then also curating a collection of existing resources, both tools and best practices that we can put together and package for the community to make it easier to do game streaming research. And with that, I will take questions.
Thank you. I saw that this site was very quiet, so please feel encouraged to also ask your questions. But just like what are your questions? There we go. I'm learning. This was so much. Yeah, in the back and then in the front.
Simon Herman, University of Canterbury, New Zealand. So my question is, Twitch is used for a lot of streaming, but not necessarily only for game-related streaming. Do you think there's a difference between the applicability?
Yeah, so we thought about that a little bit. And largely, we focused on game streaming, partially because that's more or less the focus of our lab, but also there's an inherent sort of data source in the game itself when you're doing game streaming, whereas if it's just live streaming, it's a person out in the real world with a camera. And so either if you want to be capturing data and experience like that, you need much more invasive kinds of tracking, or you need to structure the interaction a little differently. And so we largely focused on game streaming in particular to this study. There's actually a lot of other streaming research that we do cite and we talk about, but we wanted to focus specifically on games, mainly for our own purposes, but also because of that data source capacity that would be missing otherwise.
Hi, Vera van den Abelen, KU Leuven. I was wondering because you choose in this presentation to focus on the division between technology supported and challenged and absent. But on the one hand, I wonder why this is like the theme you want to focus on, and additionally, then I want to ask you: are there other important themes that you picked up from this literature study? After all, there are 46 papers. Something that you see where it is going, or where there's really a strong need for support or other kind of stuff?
Yeah, so we actually do have some sort of preliminary results from that follow-up interviewing and surveying people that are more on the logistical end that actually do bleed into some of those technically agnostic kinds of studies. Things like reaching out to streamers, finding streamers to participate. Some interesting sort of weird ethical quandaries that often streamers don't want to be anonymous, which gives you sort of a really weird way of conducting research. So we've seen some things like that that are more on the best practice side that didn't really show up because you don't really see that. Like that's kind of like the hidden process of research that doesn't go into papers, so it's hard to get it out of a literature review. But we are starting to see a little bit more of that in reaching out to people, but we're also looking to hear back from more over time.
Can I? Okay. I was just curious, did you find anything on toxicness and how streamers want to deal with that? And
there is some, I'm blanking off the top of my head, but it's in the paper, the whole corpus is there, so.
Right, hi, Juhan Tampere University. Thanks for a nice presentation. So I was wondering, in the title of the paper it says it provides a toolkit, or at least that's what I take away from it. So I was wondering, having also done a couple of literature reviews, it's very difficult usually to set agenda based on them, but sort of in your paper, what is the toolkit? So what kind of tools can I take out of it from this box?
Well, so the toolkit, the Torta toolkit, well, partially is just a nice Torta Twitch toolkit, is nice and alliterative. But it's sort of motivating that, is there a commonality that we can start to pull together and then find best practices? It's not yet a toolkit, which is sort of the Tord bit. And what we are seeing in it is sort of these common approaches to different kinds of modality, so video, chat, stuff like that. And then getting a better sense of it's essentially like more like the need finding of building a toolkit. And by toolkit, I mean like an actual technical contribution of software. Our sort of next step now is figuring out what exactly do we need to address, not just essentially like what is the capability, and then the next step is figuring out why is it currently hard. So that's where we'll be going with it next.
Show your appreciation again. Thank you.